Know your place. Miss Ellsworth, Walter said, smiling before the witnesses who would later watch him ask permission to cross her land. Certainly, Your Grace. I shall acquire one. Millicent Curtsied descended the broad stone steps of Netherby House in her cream gown and placed the red-sealed Braemuir conveyance into Hugh Yardley's waiting hands. When Hugh announced that the neighbouring estate and the upland sluice-feeding Netherby now belonged to her, Walter's survey stakes had to stop where they stood. The terrace went silent. Millicent remained on the lowest step with the folded vellum in her hand. Hugh, grey-haired and solemn, stood just behind her. Walter faced her in a dark navy coat and black gloves, his drainage map spread across the iron table. Near the French doors, the guests who had laughed at her stared in open shock. Walter's proposed channel would spare Netherby's meadows by sending the autumn overflow through the lane of 6 Braemuir cottages. Millicent had pointed to the danger. The room had laughed, and Walter had used that laughter to put her back in the ornamental corner assigned to a dependent widow. He had failed to notice the solicitor below the steps. "Execute it, Mr. Yardley." "Yardley," Millicent said. Hugh broke the red seal. "The purchase is complete. Braemuir House, its lands, cottages, and water rights are now the sole property of Mrs. Millicent Ellsworth." Millicent watched Walter's smile falter. "Your stakes have crossed the Braemuir boundary beside the lower burn," she said. "I require them removed before noon." He descended 2 steps, his charm restored. "A spirited acquisition, Millicent, but surely we may discuss Mrs. Ellsworth." Walter inclined his head. "Mrs. Ellsworth, the channel is necessary for the harvest. A minor diversion. Read the consent clause, Mr. Yardley." Hugh adjusted his spectacles. "No ditch road cart or labourer may cross the bounds of Braemuir without the express and written consent of its owner." The gentry began to murmur. Walter's thumb rolled once over his signet ring. For the first time that morning, he was no longer managing the room. He was considering her. "Recall your Grace." The wind lifted one edge of his map. Walter caught it with a black-gloved hand, then turned to his bailiff. "Pull every stake back to the Netherby line. No cart is to cross the old stone marker." The order carried across the terrace. The immediate battle was hers. Then Hugh unfolded the smaller water map attached to the deed. "There is another matter, madam." A dark line showed the upland burn passing through Braemuir before descending toward both estates. The main sluice stood on Millicent's ridge. Notes from the last inspection marked loose eastern stonework and a rusted gate wheel. Her triumph cooled. She owned the water. She had only 5 men fit for heavy labor and scarcely enough ready money to hire more before Michaelmas. Walter came down the remaining steps and rayed over Hugh's shoulder. "It appears your newly acquired kingdom is leaking. My sluice will be repaired, with whose army Netherby has 50 men. If that bank fails, your cottages drown first, and my lower fields follow." His tone had lost its public jest. "I request a joint inspection at dawn." Request, not command. Millicent tapped the red seal with one finger. "You may inspect Braemuir with 1 steward. Any labor on my land will be done under my direction." The corner of his mouth lifted. "As you say, Lady of Braemuir, that is not my title." "No," Walter said, "but it appears to be your position." The local contest had ended. A more dangerous one had begun. The estate that freed her from Netherby had bound their futures together with one failing gate. Walter returned to the terrace and shepherded his guests inside, with a remark about breakfast growing cold. Conversation followed him as readily as ever. Even in defeat, he could make a room move where he wished. Millicent stayed on the steps with Hugh. The red wax was warm beneath her thumb. She had pressed it twice while Walter spoke, not from fear, but to prevent herself from laughing too soon. The deed was not revenge, though the guests would surely tell the story that way. She had studied Braemuir for months and submitted her sealed bid before Walter's insult. Nearly all of the maternal settlement protected from her late husband's creditors had gone into a neglected house, exhausted fields, and a debt obligation that might yet ruin her. It was the first consequential decision of her life that no husband, guardian, or employer could overturn. Her late husband had praised her liveliness when it entertained his friends. When she asked to inspect an account or drainage plan, he had laughed as though she had performed another trick. After his death, Netherby had given her useful work copying maps and a quiet chair whenever men discussed what the maps meant. Walter's command had not driven her away. It had merely ended her last temptation to hide the fact that she was leaving. If the cottages flood, the rents fail, Hugh said quietly. Braemuir cannot bear that loss in its first year. They will not flood. You will need Netherby's labor. Millicent looked through the open doors. Walter stood among his guests, smiling as he redirected their astonishment into some new amusement. Then His Grace will learn that assistance and authority are not the same thing. That afternoon she walked the lower boundary herself, lifting her cream skirts over wet heather and checking every marker against the map. Near the proposed ditch, the oldest stone post lay flat in the mud. Moss had been scraped from its northern face and fresh earth clung to the base. It had not fallen. Someone had moved it. Millicent looked toward the ridge where the failing sluice cut a black line against the sky. Someone had expected Braemuir to remain unguarded long enough for its borders and perhaps its water to be taken. Dawn on the Scottish border came purple and damp with mist lying over the heather like uncarded wool. Millicent waited at Braemuir's wrought-iron gate in a grey riding habit, her hair pinned firmly beneath a small felt hat. She had slept in the least leaking bedchamber eaten oat bread beside a smoking grate and spent the remaining hour painting a notice. A procession appeared on the Netherby Road. Walter rode at its head on a powerful bay gelding. Behind him came 3 surveyors, 2 timber carts, and a carriage filled with several of yesterday's guests. Wicker hampers were strapped to the roof. One lady already held a parasol, though the sun had not yet found the valley. Millicent folded her arms. He had transformed an inspection into a country excursion. She stepped into the road and raised one gloved hand. Walter reined in. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellsworth. I have brought reinforcements. You have brought spectators." She pointed to the board nailed to the gatepost. He leaned over his pommel to read it. "All persons entering Braemuir must wipe their boots. The Duke of Netherby is permitted to enter with 1 steward only. All others must turn back." A laugh escaped him, bright and genuine. The sound carried down the line of carts. Millicent had expected irritation. His delight was much more dangerous. "You intend to dismiss my surveyors?" he asked. "I am capable of surveying my own watercourse. My father taught me to measure a boundary before he allowed me to ride beyond one." She nodded toward his bailiff. "You may bring Mr. Kerr. The carts, hampers, and audience may return to Netherby." Walter studied her for one long moment. She kept her chin high, though her new authority still felt like a coat cut slightly too large. Then he turned in the saddle. "Ladies and gentlemen, Braemuir's hospitality has been postponed by rain, mud, and constitutional severity. I shall report whether its owner has allowed me to survive breakfast." The carriage erupted in disappointed protests and laughter. Somehow, within 2 minutes, he had sent everyone home without making Millicent appear inhospitable. That was his gift, she thought. He could make obedience feel like amusement. The trouble began when he mistook the amusement for permission. When the road cleared, Walter dismounted and handed his reins to the bailiff. Then, with exaggerated care, he scraped each polished Hessian boot against a rough stone before crossing the threshold. "Are they satisfactory?" Millicent inspected them. "Passable. The left heel remains suspicious. I shall endeavor to reform it." They began the climb toward the upper burn. The sluice was worse than the inspection notes suggested. Rust had eaten through the gate fittings. The eastern retaining wall bowed outward, and water had opened dark seams between the stones. At the foot of the bank, alder roots had begun to pull loose from the wet earth. Millicent crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the mortar. It crumbled like stale cake. My original channel would have spared Netherby, Walter said behind her, by sacrificing 6 cottages. She rose and brushed grit from her glove. You used Mr. Caldwell's survey, did you not? Walter's brows lifted. Oswald Caldwell is considered a competent land speculator. He offered the plan as a courtesy. His courtesy is expensive. Millicent drew a copy of the old maintenance bond from her satchel. He holds this obligation against Braemuir. If the estate fails to manage the water before the first Michaelmas spate, he may call the debt and press a claim for the property. Your ditch would have directed the overflow against the cottages and made failure nearly certain. Walter read the page. His thumb moved once over his signet ring. The ease left his face. Millicent could not know whether he was more angered by Oswald's design or by having been used. The distinction mattered. A vain man might resent the insult and forget the danger. A trustworthy one would remember the families below. At last he looked toward the cottage roofs visible through the mist. Netherby will provide stone carts and labour. Braemuir will provide access and direction. A joint arrangement for the watercourse, then. Written. His gaze returned to her. You intend to put every sentence between us on paper, only the sentences that might otherwise become your announcements. His mouth curved. You do not trust me. You ordered me to know my place yesterday. I am merely marking its borders. For a heartbeat he looked almost chastened. Then the charmer returned, softer this time. I begin to suspect I shall enjoy these negotiations. Millicent folded the bond and slipped it back into her satchel. That will not make them shorter. No, he said, but perhaps less dull. The rivalry settled into a lively rhythm over the next fortnight. Millicent took possession of Braemuir House with 2 housemaids, an elderly cook. 1 sound chimney and 6 rooms that did not admit rain. The west corridor smelled of wet plaster. The library windows rattled whenever the wind changed. Yet the keys at her waist belonged to her, and the silence in the study no longer meant she had been excluded from someone else's business. Walter arrived at the boundary most days. He soon learned not to bring an entourage. Instead, he brought useful things disguised as jokes. On Tuesday, a footman delivered a heavy iron boot scraper fitted with a silver plaque engraved for diplomatic relations. Millicent laughed aloud in the empty hall. The sound startled a maid carrying coal and made the cook peer around the kitchen door. Millicent placed the gift squarely on the front step and sent Walter a note informing him that diplomatic relations remained conditional upon proper use. His reply, "My left heel submits under protest," remained beneath her inkstand. On Thursday, Oswald Caldwell rode to Braemuir. He was broad ruddy and dressed in deliberate plainness. He did not use the boot scraper. Millicent noticed. You have accepted a grave burden, Mrs. Ellsworth, he said in her cold parlour. He remained standing and refused the tea she had not offered. The Duke is amusing himself with masonry, but he lacks the discipline to complete it before the Michaelmas inspection. Sell Braemuir to me now, and I shall give you a handsome profit. You may return to London without inconvenience. I find London inconvenient. His smile did not reach his eyes. The bond requires the water to be managed by the first autumn spate. If it is not, the obligation may be called. Netherby cannot save you. Then it is fortunate I have not asked Netherby to do so. His Grace enjoys an audience more than a duty. Millicent's fingers tightened around the chairback. The insult struck because it was not wholly false. Oswald glanced toward the plans spread across her desk. A widow who sits too long over sluice figures and labour accounts soon acquires a reputation for disordered nerves. Your neighbours will begin to wonder whether Braemuir requires firmer management. Will they men are reluctant to watch a lady exhaust herself over matters beyond her strength. In time, Some responsible gentleman will be asked to take the burden from you. Millicent opened the parlor door. Then responsible gentlemen may practice their strength upon their own mud. His expression changed by a degree. You mistake me for someone frightened by gossip, Mr. Caldwell. I mistake no one. That is why I profit. You have forgotten to wipe your boots. He looked down at the mud he had left on her floor. Do not trouble, she added. You will not be crossing the threshold again. His expression hardened. Then he bowed and left. When his horse faded down the lane, Millicent touched the red seal inside her desk and shut the drawer hard. The lower clearing work was moving too slowly. She walked down to the burn where men from both estates were hauling stone with the dull obedience of labourers who expected the day to last forever. Millicent took up the tally slate. 2 teams, she called. Braemuir against Netherby. The first to clear its marked reach without cutting the bank receives hot supper before the other, and the winning side receives the ale. A Netherby tenant shouted that the cook could not possibly favour Braemuir fairly. My cook favours anyone who finishes before her soup burns. Laughter moved through the ditch. Within minutes picks rang against stone, and barrows began to fly up the path. Walter arrived in the afternoon to find the work site roaring with competition. His coat was dark green rather than ducal navy, and for once no guests followed him. Have you declared war? He asked. Only upon idleness. He surveyed the chalk marks, the slate, and the men shouting accusations of cheating across the burn. You have made them race for stew. Stew is more dependable than patriotic feeling. He laughed, stripped off his coat, and joined the Netherby side. Millicent expected him to perform. Instead he worked. He knew every Netherby tenant by name. He remembered that old Thomas Bell had an injured left shoulder and shifted him from the heavy barrow to sorting brush without announcing the kindness. When a young labourer split his palm, Walter knelt in the mud, tore a clean strip from his own linen, and bound the hand, while continuing a ridiculous argument about whether Braemuir's stones were naturally smaller. The man from Netherby's terrace had appeared made of polished laughter and reflected admiration. Here with mud on his sleeves and another man's blood staining his linen. Walter seemed stripped to something quieter, something far more dangerous to her peace. His care had no audience beyond labourers too tired to flatter him. He remembered pain that was not his own. He gave assistance without turning it into a favour that must be praised. Millicent looked away before he caught her watching. His ease with people was not false. That made his failures more vexing, not less. A man who noticed so much ought to understand when he was taking up too much space. Near sunset, the Braemuir team cleared the last marked stone by the width of a boot. The men cheered. Walter protested the measurement and demanded an impartial judge. You object to my slate? Millicent asked. I object to Braemuir's suspiciously narrow boots. Your left heel has already been judged unreliable. Walter bowed to the victors and sent the Netherby cask to Braemuir's tables anyway. When the crews left, Millicent remained to total the day's work. Walter came up the bank and reached for the slate at the same moment she did. His bare hand covered hers. The touch was warm, roughened now by wet rope and stone. Millicent's breath caught. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her face. The laughter had left his eyes, but not the warmth. You are different here, he said quietly. Here on your own ground. You do not wait to discover what the room will permit. He had not praised her liveliness and ignored her judgment. He had seen what ownership changed in her. So are you, she said. Mud improves your character. His thumb shifted once against the edge of her glove. Millicent stepped back before the warmth could become expectation. The east bank remains weak. We shore it tomorrow. Walter let her take the slate. At your command, Mrs. Ellsworth. She walked toward the house without looking back. She could feel his attention follow her all the same. 2 mornings later, fiddles woke Millicent before the cook's knock. She crossed the landing in her wrapper and looked from an upper window. Carts crowded the Braemuir lane. Villagers, neighbouring gentry servants and children poured across the meadow with baskets and tools. A wagon had been draped with Netherby colours. Walter stood upon it smiling as he directed arrivals toward roasted meat ale and the weakened East Bank. He had announced a Braemuir work day. He had not asked her. By the time Millicent reached the meadow in her riding habit, the estate looked like a fair. Strangers walked over the clay seal she had ordered, laid the previous evening. Young gentlemen treated shovels as comic props. Walter moved among them in his natural element, matching names to tasks and making every person feel essential. He had brought the labor she needed. He had also made her nearly invisible on her own land. "Move the visitors away from the East Bank," she said when she reached him. "Millicent, look at the numbers." He gestured toward the crowd. "We may finish before nightfall. They are trampling wet clay into the burn." He glanced toward the bank, but 3 people called his name at once. He answered them with quick instructions, 1 cart to the stone pile, another to the upper path, half the volunteers to the ditch. "The upper path will not bear a loaded cart," Millicent said. The road steward assured me, "This is not Netherby's road." A young lord nearby laughed and asked whether Braemuir's mud required formal introduction. Anger leapt ahead of judgment. Millicent seized a shovel and thrust it into his hands. "No introduction, my lord, only acquaintance. The mud is there." The crowd laughed. The young man bowed extravagantly and stepped backward into the traces of a stone cart. At that same instant, Walter called for the cart to turn toward the lower trench. Millicent shouted for it to halt. The driver heard both voices pulled one rein too sharply and sent the near wheel over the soft edge. The oxen bellowed. The cart lurched. Stone spilled against the clay seal. The bank gave a low, terrible groan. A section collapsed into the burn. Water burst through the gap and raced across the meadow toward the nearest cottage. For 1 heartbeat, Millicent could not move. Her joke, Walter's spectacle, their competing commands together, they had produced the very disorder she had warned against. Walter jumped from the wagon. No smile remained. He seized a timber brace and waded into the freezing water. "Sand sacks to the breach, clear the cart. Mr. Bell, take the oxen uphill." This time he gave only the orders necessary to hold the bank. Millicent recovered herself and climbed onto the fallen cart. "Braemuir men with me, pack clay behind the sacks." "Netherby, pass stone from hand to hand. No wheels near the edge." For 3 hours they worked in cold brown water. Walter held the first brace until 2 labourers relieved him. Millicent moved the crews, checked the cottage lane, and sent the housemaids to carry bedding and chairs upstairs before the water entered. The cottage floorboards were ruined. The walls held. When the breach was finally sealed, the musicians and fashionable guests had gone. Only the labourers remained mud-covered and exhausted. Walter stood on the bank in soaked shirt sleeves, water running from his hair. "This was my failing," he said, loud enough for every worker to hear. "I brought a crowd onto Braemuir without its owner's consent. I turned necessary work into an entertainment and gave orders where I had no right to give them. Netherby will replace the damaged floor bedding and stores." He faced Millicent and bowed deeply in the mud. "I apologize, Mrs. Ellsworth. There is no excuse." No jest softened the words. No explanation asked her to admire his intentions. Millicent's first impulse was to walk back to the house, lock the door, and forbid him the boundary forever. Leaving had always restored the clean feeling of control. Then she looked at the wet cottage, the waiting workers, and Walter's unguarded face. He had named the harm before the very people whose approval mattered to him. She stepped forward. "My command helped confuse the driver," she said. "I used a man and a shovel to make a point before a crowd. That was reckless." She turned to the labourers. "The breach is sealed. Tomorrow there will be 1 plan written and signed before work begins." Walter lifted his head. Relief crossed his face quickly. and without performance. Millicent did not forgive him yet, but she remained. That evening, maps dried beside the great kitchen hearth at Braemuir. The elderly cook dozed beyond the half-open scullery door, leaving a pot of broth and 2 cups on the scrubbed pine table. Walter sat opposite Millicent in a rough wool coat borrowed from the old groundskeeper. It hung too broadly across his shoulders and made him look less like a duke than a man who had been dragged from a river. The red-sealed conveyance lay between them. "Why did you buy Braemuir?" he asked. His finger stopped short of the wax. "Was it truly because of what I said on the terrace? I submitted the sealed bid 3 days before your performance." He looked up. "My husband left me a protected settlement and years of instruction on why women should not concern themselves with land." Millicent watched the fire catch along a split log. He praised my liveliness whenever it amused his guests. When I asked to see an account, he laughed as though I had performed another trick. The old humiliation still had teeth, but it no longer owned the room. "I bought Braemuir because I wanted one place where my judgment had consequences." She continued, "Your command mattered because it ended my final temptation to hide what I had done." Walter's gaze fell to his hands. "I knew your objection to the ditch deserved examination." She waited. The room laughed. "I felt it turn against me, so I made it turn against you instead." His voice held no polish. "I have spent years believing that if people are delighted, they cannot demand much from me. It is a cowardly sort of freedom." Millicent studied him. "And I have spent years believing that departure is the same as freedom. Is it not?" "Sometimes." She looked toward the dark passage leading to the hall. "Sometimes it is only the quickest way to avoid discovering whether anyone might be worth depending upon." The silence that followed was not empty. It felt like standing together on the first plank of an unfinished bridge. Walter drew a clean sheet of paper toward him. "Then we shall build something less dangerous than today's bank." He wrote a joint watercourse charter in plain language. Braemuir retained final authority over all work on its land. No announcement, negotiation, or alteration would be made without Millicent's written consent. Netherby would provide labour carts and county communication only within the instructions she approved. He placed the quill beside her hand. "Read every line." She did. Then she amended 2 phrases. Walter accepted both without argument and signed. Millicent signed beneath him. Trust did not arrive as warmth or surrender. It arrived as his name beneath limits he had chosen to respect. At breakfast the next morning, Hugh brought a notice from Oswald Caldwell. A hard western storm was expected before Michaelmas Eve, and Oswald had declared his intention to inspect the sluice at midnight 3 days hence. The deadline now had an hour. Walter failed to appear at Braemuir on Tuesday morning. By noon, Oswald's clerk had carried a story through both villages. The Duke of Netherby had ridden privately to Caldwell Hall because he doubted the widow could keep her estate. Bywana Carter had improved the tale into a secret agreement to divide Braemuir after the flood. Millicent read Walter's unsigned place on the day's work order until the ink blurred. He had promised. Then he had gone behind a closed door and tried to manage her future without her. Hugh urged her to wait until Walter returned. Millicent heard only the old familiar language of delay. Wait for the gentleman, wait for the explanation, wait until authority arrived in a mail coat. She ordered her horse. The shortcut to the upper gate crossed wet shale above the burn. Halfway along the crag the mare slipped. Millicent threw herself clear and landed hard on one knee. Pain tore through her ankle, but anger drove her upright. She reached the sluice near dusk. Wind-thrown branches had jammed the spillway. She dragged at the smallest, then the next, until bark cut through her gloves. The main wheel would not move. Below, crews from both estates had gathered without the signed instructions she had left unfinished. No one knew whether to strengthen the lower bank or clear the ancient channel first. Her absence had cost the very hours she meant to save. Walter found her beside the gate in freezing rain. His face went white when he saw her bleeding hands and the angle at which she held her foot. Millicent. He stopped several paces away. May I come nearer? Did you go to Caldwell Hall? Yes. The clean answer hurt more than an excuse. I offered him Netherby hunting rights and repayment of his inspection expenses. If he delayed until the storm passed, Walter said. I offered nothing belonging to Braemuir. He refused, then used the meeting exactly as you feared. You met him without telling me. I did. You allowed him to learn that you believed I required time he had not granted. I did. And you thought I need not know. Walter said nothing. Rain struck the iron gate and ran in silver streams from Millicent's sleeves. He took one cautious step forward and offered his arm. She recoiled. No. His hand dropped. You did not lie to me, she said. That would almost have been simpler. You decided the truth affecting my land could be kept from me until you had arranged it to your satisfaction. I thought to spare you another uncertainty. You thought to choose which uncertainties I was permitted to bear. The words struck him. She saw it in the stillness of his face. That is the same room, Walter, she said. The same closed door. Only this time you placed a kinder carpet before it. His eyes shut briefly. You promised me authority in writing. Then, at the first danger, you returned to the habit that made the promise necessary. I did. She had wanted him to defend himself. His refusal to do so left her anger with nowhere easy to land. I cannot command men who believe Netherby is privately preparing for my failure, she said. Oswald did not merely spread a rumor. You carried it to his door and gave it your coat. Walter looked toward the workers waiting below, their lanterns appearing through the rain. What must I do? For once, do not ask me to design your apology. A flicker of pain crossed his face. He accepted that too. No bargain concerning Braemuir, he said slowly. No promise concerning its water. No silence concerning danger to its people. I will do none of those things without your knowledge and consent. Millicent's fingers tightened around the stone. Do not swear that you will never make another mistake. Only fools and lovers make promises large enough to conceal the truth. A faint, rueful breath escaped him. It was not quite a laugh. Then I promise something smaller and more difficult, he said. When I am uncertain, I will tell you before I act. When I fail, you will hear it from me before you hear it from the county. And I will never again decide that ignorance is a kindness you should receive from my hand. The rain seemed louder in the pause that followed. Millicent wanted to believe him. That was precisely what frightened her. Below them, the burn rose against the bank. The main gate groaned beneath the weight. Her ankle throbbed. Her hands bled. 50 men waited for instructions she could not deliver from the ridge alone. Leaving would not save the cottages. Punishing Walter by refusing what Braemuir needed would only make Oswald correct. And I rode here alone, she said, because waiting for you felt too much like surrender. Now the crews have lost half a day. Walter did not seize the admission as forgiveness. Tell me what must be done. She looked at the arm he had lowered. Offer it again. He did. This time, Millicent took it. He supported her weight without lifting her, without telling her what she ought to do. The main gate cannot be rebuilt before tomorrow night, she said. We must clear the ancient side channel and open its gates in stages. Every crew must move together. They will. No bargains, no announcements without my name, no changing the plan to please a crowd. Agreed. She tightened her grip on his sleeve. Then take me down to the workers. I will give the orders. You will make them listen. For once, Walter did not promise more than she had asked. Yes, Mrs. Ellsworth. Michaelmas Eve brought the storm before sunset. Rain hammered the hills, and the burn rose brown and violent beneath the shared stone bridge. Tenants from both estates gathered with lanterns, ropes, and spades. Hugh waited beneath the bridge with the map wrapped in oilcloth. Across the water, Oswald Caldwell held a folded notice beneath his oiled cape. "The maintenance period is ended," he called. "The main sluice is failing. Braemuir defaults to me." Millicent stepped into the lantern light, leaning on a stout ash stick. Pain pulsed through her ankle, but the map in her hand was steady. "The inspection is fixed for midnight," she called back. "It is 8 o'clock. You own nothing here." Oswald's gaze moved over the men gathered behind her. Have they been told that their mistress rode alone into a storm and injured herself because the Duke had already lost faith in her? Unease moved through the nearest labourers. Millicent smiled. "They have now been told that you employ village gossip because the water refuses to obey you." A few men laughed. Oswald's face darkened. She turned away before he could answer. The crews still shifted uneasily. Some saw only an injured widow asking them to trust an abandoned channel. Walter stood at the boundary stone. Rain streamed from the brim of his hat. He could have crossed with one order, and no one would have stopped him. Instead, he removed his hat. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, his voice carrying over water and wind, "may Netherby enter Braemuir?" The question moved through the crowd like a bell stroke. Millicent met his gaze. This was the answer to the terrace, not an apology spoken in private, but authority returned before everyone who might have doubted it. "You may cross, your grace, under my direction." Walter led his men over the line, then turned to face them. "Braemuir commands tonight. Netherby has the honor of obeying. Look to Mrs. Ellsworth. Move when she tells you and not before." The crews answered with a rough shout. Millicent opened the map across a cartboard. "First company, clear the deadfall from the side channel. Second, take ropes to the upper gate. Third, build the lower clay wall 2 feet higher. No cart goes near the east bank." Walter repeated each order, matched men to tasks, and made one voice carry through the noise. For 3 hours, Millicent read the rising water. The side channel began to run, then choked on old roots. "Axes forward," she called. Men hacked through the roots. Water nearly swept one laborer away. Walter caught his rope, hauled him back, then looked to Millicent for the next order. No performance entered his face. No triumph asked the workers to admire him. He acted, returned to his place, and waited for her judgment. She checked the gate marks on the old map. "Raise the first sluice 1 hand. Hold there." The iron gears shrieked. Water entered the side channel too quickly, striking the outer bank. "Lower it half." Walter passed the command. The gate dropped. The channel steadied. Oswald urged his horse nearer. "You are delaying the inevitable." Millicent did not spare him a glance. At 11, the main wall groaned. Loose stones shifted beneath the torrent. Hugh called the time from the bridge. Millicent watched the current strike the eastern curve, counted the pulse between surges, and saw the moment the pressure changed. Second gate now. 2 hands. Then the third together. Walter and 4 men threw their weight against the winch. The wheel resisted, moved an inch, and stopped. Millicent planted her stick in the mud. Again the men strained. Rust broke with a crack. The gate lifted. Floodwater surged into the ancient cut, swept past the cottage lane, and spread across the empty marsh below. The pressure against the main sluice fell. 1 stone slipped, but the wall held. The cottages remained dark, dry shapes above the water. A cheer rose from the bridge, ragged at first, then thunderous. Oswald pushed forward with his notice. "The gate is damaged. The bond is mine." Hugh opened the oilcloth and held the clause beneath his lantern. "The obligation requires the water to be managed and the properties preserved before midnight. Both conditions are met. Your claim has failed." Oswald looked from the flowing side channel to the united crews. No one moved to support him. The men who had heard his warning about a widow's unsteady judgment now looked toward the woman who had predicted each turn of the flood. He folded the notice. "One final matter," Mr. Caldwell Hugh called. "Braemuir has no road left open to a gentleman who will not wipe the mud from his boots." A rough laugh moved through the gathered men. Oswald wheeled his horse and rode into the rain. Walter came to Millicent, mud to his knees and blood along one cheek. He stopped beyond the reach of her hand. "I once ordered you to know your place," he said, for the village to hear. "I was wrong. This is your land, your work, and your victory. Netherby stands tonight because you allowed us to stand with you." He bowed. Millicent looked at the men who had obeyed her plan and at the cottages still standing above the flood. Walter's words mattered, but they did not create her authority. They acknowledged what she had already proved. She held out her hand. Walter took it only after she nodded. 3 weeks later, the repaired side channel ran clear beneath a cold autumn sun. The floodage had new floorboards. Braemuir's tenants had begun clearing the west orchard, and the roof over Millicent's study no longer dripped upon the accounts. She sat at her desk with the original conveyance locked in the upper drawer. Beside it lay the completed watercourse charter, bearing her name above Walter's instructions for Netherby labour. A knock sounded below. Walter stood alone on the front step. No carriage waited behind him. No guests' hampers or musicians filled the lane. His boots rested neatly against the iron scraper. Millicent opened the door but did not move aside. "Good morning, Your Grace. Have you wiped them meticulously? The left heel has embraced reform." His smile was familiar, but he did not use it to enter. "I have brought the final charter," he said. "A permanent alliance between Netherby and Braemuir concerning the water. I may sign that." He drew a careful breath. "I have also come to ask whether in time you might choose a permanent alliance with me. Not because our lands require it, because I would rather ask for a place beside you than command any room without you." Millicent looked at the man who had learned to wait at her threshold. He had not become solemn. Humour still hovered at the edges of his mouth. Brightness still belonged to him. But now he allowed silence to remain when the answer was not his to supply. She had wanted land so no one could assign her a corner. Braemuir was hers. That ownership made invitation possible. She carried the charter to the hall table, lit a taper, and melted a little wax from the red packet kept with her conveyance. The same wax that had sealed her departure now sealed an agreement freely chosen. She pressed her mark beneath both signatures. "Any husband of mine must ask before announcing," she said. "Listen before charming and occasionally accept correction from his boots." Walter's smile brightened. "I accept every term." Millicent held out her hand. "Then come inside, Walter." He crossed only when she drew him over the threshold. Their first kiss was brief, private, and entirely hers to begin. Behind them, the new charter cooled beside the old key. The deed remained locked in Millicent's desk. Walter had not given her a place. She had chosen one, and chosen to let him stay. The end.